And good evening and welcome to the fourth and final of our In Conversation series for Monash Law. I'm Jon Faine, and I'd like to start by, as always, acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri, the Bunurong, the Wathaurong people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also express on a personal note my impatience for a treaty or treaties in order to address some of the problems that we've still got from our colonial past. Rachel Doyle, SC, Senior Counsel, is our fourth and final guest in this year's series of In Conversation for Monash Law. She's an outspoken, I think I can say, activist at the Melbourne Bar, but Australia-wide, for a rethink of the internal culture of the bar, in particular as it comes to respect for women practitioners in the law. Last year, I think it was, or was it the year before, she published a booklet through Monash Uni Publishing called Power and Consent. Rachel, thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for your outspokenness. How hard is it to be an outspoken woman at the bar, at the forefront of this attempt to rethink the role of women in the law?
It's interesting that you and others have phrased the question in that way. How hard is it? Confession or spoiler alert, I tend to run off at the mouth a fair bit, and that might be very predictable because that's what I'm paid to do, paid to talk.
Great, I'll take the mic off and go for a walk. I'll come back in half an hour.
But in my spare time, I also like to talk about the things I'm passionate about. I would have to put this, to be fair, in two ways. It's not difficult for me to speak out. I want to explain why I say that in a moment. And also, no one's ever tried to muzzle me. But as the book says, I'm very conscious of the fact there may be very good reason why it's not hard for me. I am a relatively privileged person, male or female, in our society and in the legal community. I come from a family not with a long tradition in the law, but my father was in the law. And I think that does give you a certain leg up in terms of people listening to you, doors opening for you and the rest. I've also worked very hard to get where I am, but I'm not blind to the fact that there is some advantage that comes with background in the law and a family background in the law. And for that reason, I think it's been possible for me to speak out when I felt I wanted to or needed to. There may be another reason as well, which is I've been at the bar about 25 years, and I might put it this way, I've spent my coin sparingly and wisely. I've only ever spoken out on a couple of topics, and a couple of them have been related to life at the bar, and they're boring to non-lawyers, but things about wigs, the QC, KC, SC debate, and some issues about junior practitioners. And the other topic has mostly been about women. So perhaps it's because I only speak when I feel I need to.
A lot of women stay quiet about things that give them the shits, to use colloquial language, because it's good for their career to be seen to be maybe wanting change, but not being too much of an activist. But you are an activist.
Perhaps I am. I probably am. And again, it might also come from speaking, not speaking all the time, speaking on my chosen topics, and when I already had a relative degree of seniority at the bar, that might be part of it. And I'm conscious of the fact that I feel that I should speak for others. So I'm happy to speak for other women who are more junior, and happy to speak for parents at the bar in particular, because there are a number of structural issues around that. And I'm therefore comfortable and confident in speaking for others because I come from that position of seniority and some, advantages in my background.
What change have you already seen?
There has been some change at the bar. The most particular and welcome change has been that I suppose a few things were happening at once, but my book was published in the aftermath of the revelations about Dyson Hayden. There have been others, sadly. I think it happened in parallel with the Respect at Work project that's been very important. And
there was Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame. People have forgotten, I think already, even though it's only recent history, just how volatile that climate was.
Everything was happening all at once. And the Supreme Court and other courts said, all right, we'll get on board, something needs to change. And at the same time, the bar recognised it needed to do some training in sexual harassment, and the Supreme Court also embraced a recommendation that arose out of one of the investigations generally into the law and the courts in Victoria. And one of the recommendations was that anyone who wants to apply to become senior counsel will need to demonstrate that they've done a particular module of sexual harassment training, which was a clever way to do it, because if that's a gateway to applying to become senior counsel, people will do it. And the bar said, and we'll also train every new person who comes and joins the bar. So capturing at two ends. One important note is we're not capturing the people who are already senior practitioners, but that's for another day. And again, to the bar's credit, it's late, but I think it's good to embrace a change when it's offered in good faith. They consulted a number of people about what the training should look like, and a number of people have been instrumental and useful in preparing that training. And I've been involved in the training delivered to the new bar readers, the last 4 or 5 intakes we've trained, and the last 2 years, the people who want to apply for silk sort of training. I've also delivered training to the judges of the Federal Circuit Court. Lots of institutions have finally recognised the need for training. But what's been great about it is it has been training that has had in mind one of the key themes in my book, which is, can we stop talking to the victims and start talking to the perpetrators? So it's as simple as it's all in active language. A lot of it is group-based with hypotheticals, and it is all directed at telling perpetrators, this has to stop. You have a problem, not us. We also do that stuff at the end about telling victims where they can complain and what they can do. But there's a much heavier perpetrator focus element to it, and I think that's been really good. And shout out to Ken Hayne, retired High Court judge who's back at the Victorian Bar. He has been involved in delivering all of those sessions, and it's been very powerful because to the extent we've ever had voluntary sessions of this type previously, usually delivered by women to rooms of other women nodding about experiences they've been through, perpetrators off somewhere else having a drink. Once it was made mandatory, and once a man was looking down, a lot was done online initially, looking down the barrel of the camera saying, you have to stop it. And he gave all sorts of arguments about the detriment to the profession, the loss of bright young women from the profession. And it was very powerful. So I'm very glad that he was willing to be involved in that.
Can you measure the change? Can you see the change? That's now been underway for long enough for the culture to have been adjusted. Can you see it?
I think so. It's harder to get a handle or a read on the culture now in post-COVID world because we're less often in the same room together doing things at the same time. But there are enough events and occasions in and out of court and around the bar to see some positive changes. Unfortunately, I think these things go hand in hand because there's now a greater recognition. We're getting more reports, though, of sexual harassment. I don't think that's because it's oddly increased since the training started.
No,
I think
people
it's
are more
the level
prepared
of perception
to speak about it.
Exactly.
People are emboldened. Women who previously thought this is my lot, I have to put up with it, now realise they don't have to.
That's right. And a lot of the training has been directed at, I don't know that this is always a helpful term, but at bystander training, and that is giving people tools, literally phrases to use, men and women to use if they see it happening or see a situation developing where it might. And I've been amazed how often people have said to me, I found that very useful to have a set of phrases that I can use to run interference when I see an old guy who's used to doing this sort of thing, how I can head him off at the pass. So I think that is helping.
It's not just at the bar, of course, it's within the solicitor side of the profession as well. And it's about, all sexual assault's about power and the power imbalance in such a hierarchical profession. You can't change the hierarchical nature of the legal profession. I think that's pretty much a given. More senior, older practitioners, people strive to become one of those senior practitioners, and that's where the great rewards are, both to ego and pocket. But you can change the power dynamic within that hierarchy, can't you?
I think you can. And in the lead up to one of these training sessions, I spoke to Kate Eastman, who's at the Sydney Bar, about this, and she's an expert in the area. And she had a great line that I used in particular when training judges and registrars of the court. She said that, like you say, we're never going to change the hierarchy. And in fact, you probably can't. You do need to have a leader of a legal team, and you do need to have someone who's going to stand up at the end of the day and present the argument. But in terms of how we work together, we can make it better. And a great topic or idea she introduced me to was this idea that there are a lot of judges who say, oh, but I'm one of the good ones. I always make it clear to my associates so they can tell me when my jokes have gone too far, or they can tell me when this and that has happened. And she said, and I found it very powerful, stop making the younger, more junior person the custodian of the boundaries. Own it. You're the adult, you're the judge, you're the public servant with tenure. Own it. And I found that very useful and powerful too with Silks, with senior counsel as well, saying to them, come on, with all of your privilege and your cachet and the power that you wield, obvious and less obvious types of power. You be the custodian of the boundary. Don't make it their job to mark out what they can and can't take. You be the grown-up, you mark out the boundaries.
It's not as if the legal profession's the only part of the economy where this is happening. It's happening across the board, but the legal profession's always been very insular, and the bar in particular has always been seen as a bit of a club. Now, you don't want to lose that at the same time, do you? That collegial open door, we're all in this. And, you've just finished a big piece of litigation in the federal court. You probably can't count the hours you've been working. And when you're putting in those hours, you don't see anyone else, you don't mix with anyone else, you start at ridiculous hours in the morning, you finish at ridiculous hours at night, and on it goes. It's not surprising, really, is it, that all sorts of relationships develop within those close teams?
I think that's right.
Assuming they're consensual.
It's an unusual workplace because we don't have an HR department. I mean, we have an ethics committee, we have a bar council, but we don't have an HR department. I think by definition, I'll admit this, barristers usually aren't team players. And so that's an issue as well. You're right. Lots of wonderful consensual relationships, short-term and long-term, develop in the law as they do in all workplaces, but all the more so because there's these long hours and you're sort of in the trenches together, and sometimes these intimacies develop more quickly and intensely. Sometimes it's because you've become quite isolated from other social groups, and you rightly or wrongly feel there's no one else who understands what I'm going through except the other people in this team. And that's a feeling I had, particularly when I was a younger barrister. You just think no one else can understand this level of stress except this other barrister who's working on it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And they're kind of cute too. Yeah, there's that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But when that's distorted by a power imbalance that's exploited, that's a problem. When the power imbalance is recognised by the person who has the power and they don't do anything to exploit it, it's not a problem.
Sure.
And I think that's the way it needs to be managed.
There's a bit of enabling though too, and I'm thinking of one notorious predator who I am so tempted to name, but I won't. And everyone knew about this individual's predatory behaviour, but no one ever did anything about it. That has to change too, doesn't it?
That has really puzzled me, because there's been a more recent, so a post-Dyson Hayden revelation about a Supreme Court judge. And I read about it and hadn't heard about it before. And then a lot of people said, oh, it was an open secret, whatever that is, everyone knew, but I didn't know. And I couldn't find any person who would admit that they knew about it from the source. Some people said they knew it more broadly, but I did have an opportunity.
Barristers are great gossips, aren't they?
I did have an opportunity to ask a judge who had overlapped with that judge, did you hear about it? They said, yes, I heard about it. I said, wouldn't a lot of trouble have been headed off at the pass if you'd went and knocked on his door and said, can we have a difficult conversation over a cup of tea? And let the judge pour his heart out and tell you whether he thought it was consensual or not and get to the bottom of it. And I've had many versions of that conversation over the last couple of years where I've said to people, it's our job to have difficult conversations. We have to give clients bad news all the time. We have to deliver unsuccessful submissions all the time in court. We need to learn how to do it on our floor in chambers or down the road in a cafe. We have to ring a colleague and say, we need to have a chat. And I have offered to do that for any juniors who don't want to go down a formal path or don't think they need to yet, but just want me to tell a senior person, I've been told about this, there's no action going to be taken, but you are being watched. It has been clocked. There might be all sorts of reasons why this happened. You might think that it's not fair that you're being criticised, but just so you know, I know. And I'm hoping that that kind of approach in the future might, as I say, head a lot of things off at the pass and avoid a world of pain.
Have any of the young women you've offered to do it for taken up the offer?
It's interesting. Only a couple have, and a couple of others where something has clearly happened that they've reported to me. A couple have still said, please don't take it anywhere else. I'm the breadwinner in my family, or please don't take it anywhere else or until I'm more senior because I can't. That is still a problem.
Yep. And I mean, I'll be astonished if it's not still a problem when, we're all long gone.
Yeah.
But things are getting better is the fundamental bottom line to this conversation, isn't it?
I think they are.
Even by having conversations like this one, things are
I think they are. And I also, this is going to sound a bit arbitrary, but I feel like younger crop of barristers, and by younger I only mean like sort of below 55, are a bit different. Because I delivered 2 rounds of training to aspirants to senior counsel, and so by dint of where you're going to be in your career, you have to have been at the bar, say, about 10 years, but not 20 years. And so you're getting a band of people who are aged about 40 to 55. And in particular, I left one of those sessions. They go for hours on a weekend, and you have to come in and do it. And I left on an absolute high, because in the small group that I worked with, it was, by dint of the numbers, it was still mostly men, a few women there. People in that group were so passionate and innovative and helpful. They'd come from large law firms. Some of them had great HR type of ideas about combating harassment and the structural issues that lead to it. They were keen to learn. They were keen to contribute. They all just seemed also like really nice people. And it might sound strange, I didn't already know them, but the bar's big, and I hadn't met some of these people ever before. And I left thinking, gee, the future of the bar is in good hands. There are some incredible, fantastic people out there who are coming up through the ranks. So yes, I do think it's changing.
You'd think the bar should be a very female-friendly way of working, because the way of the bar, which is, you take a job, you do it, you finish it, you can set your own hours, you can say yes or no to a brief and so on. You'd think it should suit people, parents of both genders or all genders, who are looking for a flexible work arrangement.
So long as you don't mind not sleeping, yes. It's not the case that we set our own hours. I mean, the court does, the client's expectations do, and nervous firms who like to shift all responsibility to barristers really set the conditions that we work under. That's my view. They're pretty excruciating conditions, very well remunerated, excruciating conditions. Is there flexibility? There's flexibility to turn the tap on and off. So what you can do...
You can say no to a job.
You can.
And some people do. Some people are better at it than others.
Yeah. I think it's all about managing your own time over the year or over a week.
And your own ambition.
Yes, partly, yes. It also depends on what area you work in. So you said you gave an example, you give a matter and then it finishes. But I do quite a lot of class actions that go for years. So if you step into it, of course you can step out, but under the bar rules you ought not, other than if you've got a very pressing reason why
you ruin your reputation if you do that and no one briefs you again.
So you step in. Other matters are of a shorter compass. Some criminal matters, family law matters, other civil matters maybe of a shorter compass. But in the type of law that I do, it's just not possible for me to say I work 3 days a week. What I could say is that I work 7 months a year. That could be the way of doing it.
And there's plenty who do.
And,
they head off to the villa in Italy or wherever it might be for the other part of the year.
Sure. And I have used that capacity to do what I call intensive parenting.
You were very generous not slapping me down for that. Yeah.
Well, I've used that capacity for intensive parenting. So in pre-COVID times, before we knew this would happen, I took, must have been about 6 months off when my youngest child was 5, about to start prep. So this is only a couple of years ago. And in the lead up to it, because my matters are so long, I was running things down and I had to tell a lot of people, just remember in 2020, I won't be working for 6 months. And people were horrified and judges kept saying, why is that again, Ms. Doyle, are you on sabbatical? And I had to say, I am parenting a 4-year-old who's about to turn 5 in that window. I want to see her start prep.
Yep.
And I would litter transcript with that so that people coming behind me can feel more confident to say that as well. Because I could tell that the look on some judges and solicitors' faces was, I seem to vaguely remember you taking parental leave. Yes, I have a 15-year-old. I took 9 months off for her. I have a 5-year-old. I took 5 months off after I had her. But, they keep growing and they keep needing you. It's funny that.
Yeah, very inconvenient.
And prep's kind of important. So, yes, I've used those career breaks, but to do these sort of periods of intensive parenting. And I'm planning another one when the 15-year-old is in year 12. And what I have seen is that men and women at the bar are doing that more often as well. They're planning these times either when their child's going through a hard time, and many children in Victoria are going through very hard times at the moment, particularly teenagers. And many are also programming in time off in year 11 or 12 to be there for teenagers who need them. And it's interesting because a lot of people generally, but lawyers think, I must make sure that I get that time off when my baby's small. Not necessarily. There are lots of people who love your child or who you can pay to pay good attention to your child when they're pre-verbal, when they're young, but only you can go to the school assembly when they're in year 1. Only you can be there if they get an eating disorder when they're 13. Only you can help them choose their subjects. You can't pay the nanny to go to the Mother's Day stall.
Doesn't work.
So I think the more that we think about being available for those other events, the better. The more that male practitioners do that as well, the better.
Sure.
And the more that senior people do it, the better. And being relatively senior but having a relatively young child, I thought it was important that I make it or normalise it for younger men and women who are parents so that they know that they might be brave enough to say it to a judge or to a solicitor or a client as well.
Whereas barely a decade ago, for instance, if you'd said, no, I'm not available for that because I'm actually going to be a parent that month, people would have said, aren't you committed to your career?
That's right. That's right. And my pushback on that has been on many fronts, including, hang on a minute, there were guys at the bar who would say, I'm doing a Royal Commission in Perth for a year, or I've got a long trial in Sydney for a year, and you didn't wipe them out. You didn't decide they weren't serious. You didn't decide they weren't a true Melbourne practitioner. So why do it in relation to parents?
Yep. If you're not there, it doesn't matter what the reason for it is. You're just not there.
Yeah.
The bar could do a lot more to support younger women coming through in terms of, I'm thinking of in-house childcare, all those sorts of things. Are those innovations even workshopped?
Yes. I probably have a controversial view on that, but I'll first of all start with something quite incredible that the bar did. It's been around so long now, I don't know when it was introduced, but it was certainly around before I had my 15-year-old. That the bar is surprisingly quite a socialist place in this sense. Many years ago, so it must be 16, 17 years ago, the Bar Council decided that we would pool our subscriptions and subsidise the rent, and our rents are quite expensive in the buildings up and down this street, subsidise the rent of any parent, and back then it was only women who did this, who took parental leave. And when I had my 15-year-old, other barristers paid, at that stage, I think it was 70% of my rent for 6 months.
While you weren't working?
While I wasn't working.
So you could keep chambers?
Keep my room. That's now had to be, because so many people have taken it up, they've had to reduce the percentage and cap it, but I still think that's fair enough. And now more men have taken it up. So our rent is still subsidised when we are on parental leave. And all you have to do is commit that you won't work more than, I think it's 8 or 10 hours a week, which you might want to do if you need to keep a matter ticking along or if a long-standing client wants to hear from you. But otherwise, you can just focus on your child. And more people have taken that up. And that's been invaluable because traditionally women gave up their room. And that was that. Childcare, yes, the former Chief Justice of the Federal Court, Chief Justice Black, raised a number of times with me informally, with bar councils, with practitioners over the years, should we sponsor some sort of joint project about childcare? And my view was no. Our core business is the law. We'll stuff it up. And also, I don't want my child coming in and only hanging out with barristers' children. I really don't. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't. So I think rather what we should do is fix childcare in this country generally. It is such a catastrophe, the expense, the difficulty in terms of access. And unless or until we get that straight, women will never participate in any part of the economy or public life or in their own social lives and living their best lives until we fix it. It's just such nonsense that there are all these women who are not participating in the way they want to. And that has a knock-on effect because the very people who might then go and get themselves qualified in childcare to look after my children can't because they're looking after their children. There's all these women in a row looking after each other's children, and it ends with somebody's mother. It ends with a grandmother somewhere doing it for free. That's where the cycle ends. And it's always a woman who steps up and does it for free in the end. And that notion has fascinated me since I heard that it was one of the big banks has introduced grandparents' leave because they noticed that they had a lot of women leaving at about 50, 55. And they did the work. They went and asked why, and they nearly all said, because my daughter or daughter-in-law needs to get back to work. she can't get a childcare place, or if she pays for childcare, her earnings will be reduced to nil.
You're working to pay for the childcare.
So this bank introduced grandparents' leave so that those women would come back and they wouldn't lose their experience. Now that's, I think, the sort of innovative thinking that we need.
And the flip side is elderly parent care, where you have to leave the workforce because you can't contemplate putting your demented or otherwise frail elderly parent into some dreadful accommodation, and you decide to do it yourselves. And that's very common across the workforce now too.
It is. I think until we adopt the sort of the Nordic approach, wherein the tax advantages that you get are only available if the other partner, who will usually be male, also takes the equivalent amount of time off. Until we do that, it won't change.
Are you a fan of working from home? Because COVID has triggered a lot of these recalibrations that you're otherwise talking about, hasn't it?
No, I'm not. I'm strongly opposed to working from home.
You don't like sitting there in your Ugg boots and your tracky dacks pretending to be all frilled up from the waist up?
Selfishly, I don't like it because I'm an extrovert. I get my energy from being around my workmates. But my opposition to it is much broader than that.
Yeah.
I think that to work as a team, you need to be in-person collaborating. Mostly, you might do that 90% of the time and 10% of the time at home. I think, to put it crudely, it's like when you're training a toddler, you give them all the rules and they have to follow them so that they then are capable of breaking out or having a late night once and now. If you have a system where all young people are always at home, sort of living their best lives, doing it their way. I mean, maybe this is just jealousy. That solicitors think that you can, do, Pilates at 10 on a Monday and also have a load of washing on and do everything at the same time as doing intensive legal work.
With a cavoodle sitting around your feet. Yeah.
Hard disagree. Yeah. I think when you're working, you work. When you're parenting, you parent. Yeah. And the other problem I see is that it just entrenches the multitasking that women do all day, every day. Mm-hmm. And when people talk about flexibility, I think what's happened is a lot of women now can work from home, and you might superficially say, oh, that's great. She's gone from 4 days a week to 5. Probably while doing 10 things at once and constantly having to reschedule online meetings to run down to childcare because she and her partner have now decided, oh, well, we won't do after school care anymore. Just get them at the bell at 3:30 because you're working from home. How is she working from home if she has to keep running down to the school?
Yeah. So many women say they wish they had a wife.
There's that.
Yeah. Some do, which is wonderful, but not often in the sort of patronising way that men refer to a wife.
Yeah. So I don't think the solution is to say what we'll do is we'll get women who are great multitaskers anyway to multitask more. The solution should be, shouldn't both parents recalibrate across the board? And if that means that people work from home 1 day a week, that's okay. What I'm opposed to is the working from home 4 or 5 days a week. When you come to the office, that's when you learn to share the coffee machine, the bathroom, the photocopy room. It's where you learn to share ideas.
It's the spark, it's the culture, it's all that intangible stuff that takes place. It used to be called the water cooler conversation, but that's where you go, no, there's a reason why you don't do it this way, and here, shut the door and I'll tell you why. You can't do that online.
And there's also the casual mentoring rather than the formal mentoring. So there's many times I hop in the lift after court, and by dint of the fact that someone's wearing robes, so I might hop in and there's a junior there who's looking a bit downcast, and even if you don't know them, say hard day, and they might say, I was in front of Justice so-and-so. And I might say, oh, I know her. She's great when you get to know her. That person would never, if they'd been on Zoom court, ring me. They don't know me or they don't want to interrupt me.
No.
But we have a chat in the lift.
Yep.
And I think that's important.
Were you always going to be a barrister?
No, I went to University of Adelaide to do arts. I was very interested in an arts degree. But what I wanted to do...
What part of an arts degree?
Well, I had a plan. I wanted to do an arts degree and then do what was then a grad dip in journalism. I wanted to be a journalist.
Not too late.
Print journal. Yeah, I wanted to be a print journalist. I wanted to do legal reporting, political reporting, investigative reporting. Yeah. But I had done a very short period of work experience at the Advertiser and while at school. And somebody there had said to me, if you want to do that type of reporting, particularly the legal reporting, you really should get a law degree. Okay. So I readjusted my idea and thought I'll do arts and then law and then journalism. And I got into the first year at Adelaide. You had to do 2 degrees, and you had to do first year arts or economics and then switch. So loved that. And then you'd continue on and do both. And as I was doing the law part of it, I just fell in love with law and then didn't do journalism. So it was sort of the second option.
And did you run away from Adelaide for a reason?
I wanted to move to a bigger, more interesting city. I also was offered a job here as an associate to Justice Dawson, who was then on the High Court. And that was a great offer that it was too hard to refuse.
How did that come about?
Up till that time, the mid-90s, not many students from Adelaide Uni had been High Court associates. A couple had. Simon Blewett had been Justice McHugh's associate, and a couple over the years. But it wasn't something, and they didn't have the amazing programs that law schools have now. They didn't really tell us about it.
And Adelaide notoriously overlooked for High Court positions, both as judges and associates.
That's right. So there wasn't a natural feed in there in the sense there had never been and still hasn't been a judge from Adelaide.
There was some bloke, what was his name, who everyone said was likely to get appointed. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Well, people did think at one stage my father might get appointed, but he didn't.
At one stage, people were sure he was going to be appointed.
Yeah.
And it was regarded as a complete mystery as to why he wasn't.
Who knows? Who knows? But I must have heard, perhaps because I was a couple of years below Simon Blewett at uni, I'd sort of heard about his experience with Justice McHugh, and it kind of sparked an idea. And I didn't even really know how you did it. And, you know, it was pre-email and everything. So I just typed up letters to all the judges, and it was in the glory days. It was Chief Justice Mason and Justice Gaudron and Brennan and Dean, just amazing. So I sent letters off to all of them. And I was so naive. They were all booked up for a couple of years. And these days they're booked up for 4 or 5 years. But Justice Dawson was out of sync. He had his associates for 18 months. And so he did have an opening sort of 18 months hence. And I was invited for an interview and I got the job. And I was saying to you before the cameras came on that I had at that time been working at the DPP in Adelaide, which I loved. But my great passion was industrial law. And again, I was so naive. I thought it probably meant, well, I assumed it meant moving to Canberra. But it turned out it meant moving here and commuting to Canberra. And when I moved here, I moved in with a housemate who was ex-Monash Law School, and she and all of her mates were union officials. And I realised very quickly, it was in the Kennett era, I realised if I wanted to do industrial law, I had to be here. It's where all the union national offices were.
And there was quite a bit of industrial law during the Kennett era.
So much work available. And I was meeting the people who were at the forefront of it, and it was something I was very passionate about politically and legally. And so I realised I wasn't going back to my job at the DPP in Adelaide. I would be staying here and doing industrial law. And yes, Adelaide's a small town. I love it, but I realised that the bigger town legally, but also socially and culturally, was something that I was really interested in.
Just hold that thought. Rachel Doyle SC is the 4th and final guest in our In Conversation series for Monash Law, and I hope you're enjoying it. If we've got some questions from the LinkedIn audience, they come to me on my screen. I'll see if I can build them in, although I've still got pages of questions of my own. Anyone ever asked you what school you went to?
No, not here. People in Adelaide do ask it sometimes.
The reason, obviously, is because the pedigree sometimes is more important to some people than merit. But I think it's changing. Do you?
I think it is changing. And I still struggle sometimes to know what the answers mean when they're given here, because, you know, I arrived here after university. The names don't necessarily mean anything.
Oh, the names of the schools. The
names of the schools. I could ultimately organise them in my mind as I came to understand what people were really getting at.
Don't waste the time or energy.
But
if it's important to someone, that tells you more about them.
I think that's right. I think it's a proxy for, to be fair, I think at times it's a proxy for trying to get to understand where someone fits in. And there's one thing I'll say about it. I went to a wonderful co-ed Catholic school in Adelaide. And what the answer can give you is a bit of a shortcut, like all cliches and stereotypes. It does give you a bit of a shortcut, as long as you treat it as a rebuttable presumption, as long as you understand, well, that answer means, okay, they went to a Catholic school, they might have this type of outlook, or they might not. As long as you're careful about not assuming everything, some people find it a handy shortcut to see where someone fits in. But I agree with you.
Can also lead you down the garden path.
I agree with you. It's not a safe way to proceed. I think it's becoming less and less important, I hope. but there are still sections of the community where it's treated as if it's something that matters.
Do you see yourself as a leader of the bar? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
You're seen that way by others, in particular since the Royal Commissions and inquiries that you were so prominent in.
I do think it's my job to lead by example, and I certainly tried to do that. I haven't sought any formal leadership role. I mean, I was on the Bar Council when I was very junior for 2 or 3 years, but that cemented my view, which is A, I don't like committees or meetings, hate them. B, that's not how I want to get things done. So instead, I've thought that it was important every day in every way. So in every legal team that I lead, to be a leader. And to me, that means not dictating the answer or dictating how things will be done, but again, leading by example. So put in the hours, put in the work, but guide and support and train the people in the team. Then as far as broader bar politics or issues are concerned, perhaps I am seen as a leader. And if so, it would only be because I've been around a long time, and because on these issues that are important, I'm happy to lend my support or speak out or try to help people with training or understanding. During COVID, for example, one issue that I was very worried about, and so therefore outspoken about, was the way that the criminal bar were faring.
When there were no jury trials.
That's it. The dirty secret of the bar is, and of the law is, that once we all got over the shock of lockdown, we earned exactly the same, if not more, if we were in civil practice. And I say if not more because we didn't even lose any time in holidays or travel time. And people worked themselves into the ground, but they earned good coin for it, right? But the criminal bar were getting nothing. They were going to the wall. And I opened the paper one day in the first year of lockdowns and read, because I hadn't seen any of them, read what was happening to some of them, losing their chambers, losing their minds, losing their capacity to go on. And it meant that I was involved in a lot of agitation with Barristers Chambers Limited, the company that runs and owns our buildings, and with the bar and other senior practitioners. We didn't really necessarily succeed in what we wanted to do. I sort of exhausted every option and then ended up ringing very senior silks to say, could you tip in some money into the Barristers Benevolent Fund, because that's where we're at. I was looking for a structural change. I wanted their rents dropped by at least 50%, perhaps 80%, so they could survive. That did not happen. A modest reduction was offered to everyone, but I wanted a criminal bar targeted 80% reduction.
What about people with mixed practices?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it gets very complicated when you get into the weeds. It didn't have to be a hard and
fast rule, but in the end, I just hit the phones, and a number of senior barristers tipped in some money to the Benevolent Fund, which again, it has its own rules, and but it allowed those who were really suffering to tap into it. It had previously been reserved for illness,
disability,
and bankruptcy inspired by those things. But you know, that issue really got to me, because there's class actions, there's industrial law, there's civil disputes, but the people who matter at the bar are the criminal practitioners and the family law practitioners, and those in both those arenas who deal with the victims of family violence. They're the people who are doing the work that matters, really.
Do you want to be a judge?
No.
Never?
Never, ever.
Why not?
Don't like meetings, don't like committees.
There are judges who don't attend any meetings.
It comes down to something much more fundamental than that.
Do you want to sit in judgment on other people?
No, I'm an advocate. I prefer to persuade than decide.
Yep.
My skill set is the arguing, not the deciding. I want to stay on the advocate side of the table. I also want to be able to continue to say what I want to say on particular issues that interest me. And I respect the institution too much to think that I should be an exception, that I would take an appointment and then still speak out of turn. I would never do that. I also, I mentioned not being a team player. I don't want to be part of an institution that's public service adjacent. I just can't do it. But it's mostly about wanting to be an advocate, not a judge.
There's a lot of pressure on successful women in the legal profession to take judicial appointments in order to address the imbalance. So how do you resist that? I'll bet you've been approached.
Well, I can't obviously answer that question, but
I could, but it would be unconventional.
What I can say is,
I tried. I really tried, didn't I?
You did.
Yeah.
What I can say is I applaud and am so excited and grateful to, in particular, our state government in a couple of its iterations. It goes right back to Rob Hulls when he was Attorney General, introducing equitable briefing practices, but introducing it with teeth. He is the person who said, if you're going to be a panel firm in this state, you will demonstrate to me that you have briefed and tried to brief women. Can I say the day he brought that rule in, the next day and from every day thereafter, solicitors who never would have rang me under dictation, it would seem, because they had to tick the box saying they'd tried or had briefed women. And so those first phone calls, they were not happy. But then I got...
Tell me, what would they say?
Well, no, they wouldn't reveal that was the reason, but they would say, oh, we haven't briefed you before, but we've got this thing coming up and I've been asked by the partner to at the firm to approach you. But what it
Through
gave,
gritted teeth?
Yeah, but what it gave me and other women a chance to do is to show that we could do it. And then the repeat work isn't through gritted teeth.
No.
It's, with a happy smile. So I'm excited and grateful and always will be. And that rule or that approach followed through to the appointments, which means that our Supreme Court, I must say, is now the glittering prize in Australia-wide. They have had fantastic appointments, male and female, and any idea that anyone had that it would run things down or devalue the currency if it was seen to be done pursuant to affirmative action has been shown to be bunkum. But, as you say, it has this side effect. The women used to leave the bar after about 7 years. Most of my intake had been stripped out by parental demands and the difficulties of maintaining life in practice with young children. That's been recalibrated quite healthily, and we were going along pretty well. Then the great irony is the need to have women appointed and the desire, quite rightly, to have women appointed means that senior women get stripped out the top pretty quickly. So almost as soon as women are appointed senior counsel, they get hit with offers to be judges.
Yep. Before they've even had a chance to flap their wings and get up the flying act.
That's right. And so there's a couple of problems with that. It's good being senior counsel at the bar, and I think it would be great if more women could develop into that role over time before taking the next step, whether that be judicial appointment or something else. And it also means that very talented women disappear quickly, and they're often my friends, and I miss them because it's not that you can't see them, but if you've got matters in front of them, you can't speak to them, and it's all different. So, I'm a bit torn about that, and it does mean that there's a stripping out of senior women, and I think it's good to have role models in both spheres, at the bar and at the bench.
And there's another problem no one talks about, which is appointing women particularly, but even men too, when they're too young, and they're therefore in judicial office for a very long time. And particularly at the magistrates court level, where you're hearing so many cases, and particularly distressing ones, the county court, which has basically become a sexual abuse court, the wear and tear on doing that for a very long time, relentlessly, when you're fairly young, it's not good for people. It's just not good. And if you've got someone in their 40s who's going to be doing that for 25 or 30 years, I mean, a lot of them, I'm going to say this, it's going to cost me friends. Some of them turn sour.
They do, and/or they suffer terrible mental health issues, and sometimes with the worst imaginable conclusion to that illness. And there have been many cases like that. I agree. The need, I've been thinking about this since I worked at the DPP when I was very young. And I think back now, I was only sort of 22 when I was working there. And I loved it, but I was handed all sorts of committals to do so, by definition, working with murder. And neither my boss nor I blinked an eye when he would assign the committals and I would go out and deal with murder. And it's only later, and it sounds like a cliche, but after I had children, I thought, oh, wow, when I was 22, I was prosecuting people who had murdered their children or someone else's children.
This is when you were thinking of murdering your own.
Yeah, that kind of thing, yeah. And that and this growing awareness about vicarious trauma means that we all have to think about this and think about it pretty quickly and find a solution for the police, the police who work tirelessly in that area, for the solicitors and prosecutors at the DPP, and for magistrates and county court judges. We have to find a solution pretty quickly, because many of them are so unwell and so traumatized and so ground down. We need them to do this work. And they're champions for doing it. But if we don't start supporting them by giving them relief, by cycling them out, perhaps, there's been a High Court case about this already, but we need to cycle them out after 3 months, let them do something else, and then they can perhaps come back. But to leave people working away and having to look at the people who have
doing
to
child sex abuse for year after year after year, it ought not be possible. Ought not be an option for a police officer, a social worker, a judge, a barrister, a solicitor, court staff. It's terrible. And
we have to accept that it's changed because of the internet. It sounds trite, but I'll give you a real world example. When I worked at the DPP, I worked on a small case about abuse of children where, for another reason, police had gone to some guy's house and found a shoebox in his garage with some black and white photos of young boys who had clearly been exploited. And they were sort of quite twee looking back on it, sort of posing in front of velvet curtains that they then realised were in his house. And they were able to identify some of the boys. The senior prosecutor and I looked at it. It was probably like 100 photos. That was it. We ran the trial. That was bad enough. But that was it. It wasn't all this stuff that had been disseminated over the internet and, hundreds of hours of it. And I looked at the photos
moving images
and put them to one side.
Yep.
But imagine having to look at all of this stuff over and over again. And there are police officers and prosecutors who do it for weeks on end.
Yeah, years on end. No one talks about mental health at the bar, though. You talked about judges, and we've talked about all sorts of other ancillary professions. But traditionally barristers would anaesthetise themselves with alcohol. That's now frowned upon for very good reason. Not that means it's stopped.
And we do now have a wellbeing committee, and we do have access to the free services of psychologists.
But there's so much stigma.
There's stigma, but there's also a real hip pocket problem. And it's as simple as this. Most of us now go and get income protection insurance, and as we should. If you answer the questions honestly, you will find yourself answering, if you've been at the bar for even a year, you'll have to answer, yes, there have been times when I've had trouble sleeping. If you've been at the bar for longer than a year, you'll probably, if you're being honest, and we are to a fault, you'll have to answer that you've at some stage sought services of a psychologist.
And if you don't answer honestly, you can void your cover apart from anything else. So you have to answer honestly, but it can be against your interest to do so.
That's right. And if you've been at the bar a very long time and you're being honest, you'll probably say you have at times felt very stressed and or depressed. As soon as you answer that, you're then a problem child. You're difficult to insure. And your premium goes through. And your premium goes up. But people desperately want the insurance because we're self-employed. And if we fall in a hole, our dependents are ruined. So we're in this hole that it's almost impossible to get out of. And it is something, I don't know the answer. I'm not an insurance lawyer. I don't know the economics of it. I'm not sure what policy lever needs to be pulled. But something needs to happen so that we can honestly confront the problem, seek the help that we need, but continue in practice, not be nobbled by it, and also not be financially ruined by admitting it. Because the difficulty is, unlike in a workplace, we can't just take the time out and deal with it. As soon as we take the time out, we're not earning. And then, as you say, if you're uninsurable, then it's always a risk.
Do you recommend to young lawyers that they contemplate a career at the bar? Because the way we've talked about it in this last 50 minutes or so,
probably all the
people might go, oh my goodness, it sounds ghastly.
No, I do highly recommend it. Yeah. So especially post-COVID, I've been reminded about why I'm passionate about it.
And why are you?
Well, as you said, I've just finished a longish class action, and it's a good example. So working face-to-face with the juniors on my team, working face-to-face with my opponent. Two junior barristers in my team, and the solicitors team was probably 4 or 5 working full-time.
And grinding them into the dust, making them work 100 hours a week.
We did work those hours, but not my fault, I'd say. I love interacting with judges. I've described it as being a persuader. I do like that, but I like being a problem solver. So the style of advocacy that I like, or that I try to achieve, or I aspire to, is coming to the court and saying this is vastly complex and there's combatants here and there's all these issues, but let me break it down. Let me make it easier for you. Let me make it attractive to you to embrace my side of the proposition. Mm-hmm. I also like to throw a bit of humour in when I can. I obviously never did and never would in instances like the Bushfires Royal Commission that I worked on for 18 months. But when cases are, to be frank, just about money, I don't mind a bit of a laugh here and there, and it breaks the tension in the room. But the way that I've described the advocacy is also why I like it. I love getting all of the pieces of the puzzle, all of the pieces of evidence, all of the conflicting decisions, and synthesising everything and trying to make the pieces of the puzzle fit, of course, in a way that suits my client.
Of course.
And then present it.
Are you intensely competitive?
No.
Don't you need to be at your level?
It probably depends what you mean by competitive. I always work hard, but that's not a competition with anyone else except my own standards. I mean,
You're your own harshest critic, in other words.
Yeah. And also, I also have this fundamental view about the law. As I said, my cases now get long and big, but nothing changes from this fundamental proposition. If you're doing a drink driving case for a client at the magistrate's court or a class action on either side of a case involving a multinational, and the class action I've just done was against Domino's, it's your client's big day in court, and for some of them their only day in court, and for many of them their first day in court. Every single case is their moment, their life, their money, their reputation, and you can't roll the arm over any morning, any afternoon, any day, any week, any case. You cannot. We're well paid, so there'd be no excuse for it, but our professional standards also demand it, and my ethical standards require it. Every person who I'm acting for, whether it's pro bono or not, or whether it's seemingly important or not, must be given first-rate service, because I am their gateway to the administration of justice, and I'm an officer of the court, and I cannot tell you how seriously I take that role. It means we do everything we can for our client, but within the limits of never misleading the court, never misleading an opponent, and under modern practice we must be efficient as we can be. We can't take stupid, repetitive points. We can't repress, deny, delay, and I take that very seriously. Sure. But it's a pleasure and a privilege to do so, which is why I would say that it is a fantastic career. And it's something that I think all lawyers would find immensely rewarding, so long as they're up for the tough bits, which are the long hours, and of course the feeling exposed that many people do when it comes to the public speaking time.
And speaking of ethics, that brings us to Nicola Gobbo. Has the damage done to the collective reputation of the law, and particularly the Melbourne Bar, has that been repaired?
I'm not sure that it has. That was a severe blow. I've got to say, it made me feel really sad to see the ongoing coverage of it, and to feel...
What do you mean by the coverage?
Oh, no, just the ongoing revelations, and to feel that people...
I was reassured by them. I thought, good, they're digging and digging and digging. They might actually get to the bottom of this.
Oh, no, I agree. That's what should happen. But my dismay was that the public might be thinking, in a way, I knew it. I knew that there were lawyers who were double agents. I knew that there were lawyers who couldn't be trusted. I knew that the profession and the police were all looking after themselves. And that really, really is disturbing, that it may fuel that belief out in the community, because it's not the case. I mean, in any sector of society, you will have rogues and you will have people who do the wrong thing. I hope the community understands that it's only a couple of people. But I don't understand really why it took so long to come to light. And that's the bit that makes me very uncomfortable, and the bit that makes me wonder whether there's many things that we still don't know.
You don't think that the inquiry, it was Margaret McMurdo, wasn't it? You don't think she was able to chase every rabbit down every burrow?
Look, I didn't follow it closely enough to be able to pass any comment on that.
There were some remarkably forgetful witnesses.
Yes, yes. And
as has been known to happen from time to time under the blowtorch.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not doubting the capacity or the capacity to get to the bottom or the results of that. I'm rather dismayed that the community might be left thinking, why do we need a Royal Commission to get to the bottom of these issues? Why had it not surfaced more naturally or quickly through either the internal processes of the bar or anybody involved in those proceedings. But to the extent that it didn't, luckily, we do have the option of having someone else come in and give it a set of fresh eyes.
It's a bit like, the recommendations that were made, and I don't have them front of mind, but just in general terms, were stating the bleeding obvious, a bit like, Barnaby Joyce and the Bonk ban. We never needed someone to spell out, you're not allowed to do that. It's a bit like Christian Porter and the $1 million. You never needed someone to actually say, by the way, the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Australia should not accept a $1 million gift from a benefactor for his own personal expenses.
From an anonymous benefactor. Yeah, I know.
Do you need to spell out a barrister should not be,
wearing a wire in a conference, yeah.
And double crossing their own client and double playing the police against, and blah, 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 and bonking witnesses and all of this sort of stuff. Do you need to write that down? Apparently you do.
It would seem you do, yeah. One thing is, I'm torn because royal commissions and inquests are very important, and I've been involved in some that I think have helped change, for example, the rules in relation to some aspects of dealing with Victoria's fire season. I appeared for Rosie Batty in the inquest into the tragic death of her son, and I do feel the recommendations that came out of that were of extreme value and are being implemented. But I also, like many commentators in the press, and I think a growing body of concern in the community, just wonder if a lot of policy making is not being delegated out or shifted out to this very easy fallback, which is whenever a problem arises now, we have an inquiry or a royal commission.
Just take the heat out of it.
And I'm doubly torn because it's a great training ground for young practitioners and junior barristers to sort of cut their teeth. So I feel uneasy about it because I think there's a lot of time and effort and money that goes into royal commissions. Yeah. And with some of them, the answer is fairly clear. It's the solution that needs a lot of money thrown at it and quickly.
Yep.
And perhaps if we stepped to the solution part, we might get some things done more quickly. So one thing that troubled me about that Royal Commission is, well...
The Gobbo one.
Yes, we broadly do know what happened, although we don't know all the pieces of the puzzle that led to it happening. And it must never happen again, so why don't we go straight to that?
Yep.
And some Royal Commissions, though, must be had, because there is power in the telling the stories.
Yeah, that's right.
So institutional sex abuse, for example, the power was in the telling of the stories.
The lived experiences, yes. We've only got a minute or two, but can I just get you in that available time to redesign a law course? What would you change if you were starting with a clean sheet of paper?
The course itself?
Yes, an undergraduate law degree. This is, after all, Monash Law School that puts this on. Yeah. Yes.
The things that I remember most fondly from university, because of the level of engagement and inspiration, but also I think the way that they laid the path for me to come to the bar, are smallish tutorials, like something between 10 and 15 people, with intensive deep dives on the difficult topics.
Regardless of the subject, whether it was evidence or family law.
But in particular, I remember constitutional law and industrial law being taught at Adelaide Uni that way. And what has stuck with me was the level of engagement I was able to have with the other students in it, and that feeling of working out a solution together. So that's a note about the mode of practicing. So that's, if there are still going to be lectures online or large lectures, sure, but we should have those intensive tutorials. But there are also some things that are never taught at law school, and when you come to the bar or you come to a firm, you realise what clangers of omissions they are. Like, how do you settle a case? How do you deliver bad news to a client before, during and after a proceeding? How do you look someone in the eye and tell them, the solicitor started this, but it's actually statute barred? Or you do realise, don't you, this is a no-cost jurisdiction, so even if you win, you're going to be out of pocket. We're not taught at law school some of those things about strategy, about human communication, and about how you would resolve a case. I also think that there is still room for all of the traditional subjects. I think that they provide an essential, fantastic foundation, but I think it would be good if there was more of that practical approach about, if you're going to do law, you're going to be looking people in the eye and giving them bad news. And it comes back to what I said about harassment, difficult conversations. I think there should be more training in that.
Well, I hope this hasn't been one of them.
No.
It's been absolutely fabulous to be able to pick your brains. You've been very generous, and thank you. Could you please thank Rachel Doyle, SC?
Thanks for having me.
and published by Monash Uni Publishing. Power and Consent was her booklet that came out just last year. And that brings to a close the fourth and final of our In Conversation series for Monash Law this year. I hope you've enjoyed them, and thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.